The wind had teeth in the small town of Alverton, a place forgotten by the highways that had rerouted progress decades ago. It chewed through the thin fabric of Silas's jacket, a garment that was more memory than warmth. He sat on the curb of a gas station parking lot, a ghost haunting the edge of the fluorescent lights, his back pressed against the brick wall where a laundry vent exhaled weak, humid breaths of air. To the few customers who scurried from pump to door, he was invisible, a piece of the urban decay, as permanent and ignored as the cracks in the asphalt. His world was a 5-foot radius of concrete, a tattered wool blanket, and a dented military canteen that held only cold, metallic-tasting water. A cherry-red muscle car, a relic of a bygone era of bravado, tore into the lot, its engine a belligerent roar that shattered the quiet chill of the evening. It screeched to a halt inches from Silas's worn boots, the driver's door swinging open with aggressive carelessness. Out stepped Rick, a young man whose arrogance was as loud as his car's exhaust. He was flanked by 2 others, shadows who mimicked his sneer and swagger. They saw Silas not as a man, but as a diversion, a piece of refuse to kick on their way to buying cheap beer and cigarettes. Rick's eyes, cold and dismissive, scanned the old man, lingering on the faded, hand-stitched patch on the shoulder of his jacket. It was a simple thing, an embroidered crest weathered by sun and time. Its colors bled into a muted tapestry of greens and yellows. Rick sauntered over, his friends snickering behind him. "Well, look what we have here," he announced to the empty lot, his voice dripping with condescension. The town mascot, he nudged Silas's foot with the toe of his pristine white sneaker. Silas didn't flinch. He just stared ahead, his gaze fixed on the distant, indifferent stars. This stillness, this refusal to engage, only seemed to fuel Rick's cruelty. Rick crouched down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Silas's. The smell of cheap cologne and chewing tobacco filled the air. "What's this piece of trash, old man?" he asked, hooking a thumb toward the patch. His fingers, adorned with gaudy silver rings, darted out and pinched the fabric. "You win this in a game of bingo? Or did you pull it off a dead guy?" The question hung in the cold air, a deliberate violation. The patch was not just cloth and thread. It was a sacred text, a story Silas had carried for 50 years. Silas's jaw tightened, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. His eyes, clouded with the cataracts of age and hardship, momentarily cleared, revealing a flicker of something ancient and dangerous. But he remained silent, his stillness a shield Rick couldn't penetrate. Frustrated by the lack of reaction, Rick snatched at the patch, yanking the worn fabric of the jacket. The threads holding it screamed in protest. Silas's hand shot up, not to strike, but to cover the insignia, his gnarled fingers pressing it protectively against his shoulder. His touch was gentle, reverent. This small act of defense was all Rick needed. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Protective of your garbage, are we?" He stood up, pulling a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket and letting it flutter to the grimy ground at Silas's feet. Then he dug into his pocket for change, scattering a handful of coins that clattered and rolled across the concrete. "Here," he spat, "go buy yourself a new life. Maybe one where you're not a pathetic old bum." The humiliation was a public spectacle. The gas station attendant, a teenager named Kevin, watched from behind the safety of the plate glass window, his face a mixture of fear and pity. A woman fueling her minivan saw the exchange, quickly averted her eyes, and herded her young son into the car, locking the doors with an audible click. Their silence was a verdict, a confirmation of Silas's worthlessness in the eyes of the world. He was alone, a man stripped down to nothing but a memory sewn onto a sleeve, and even that was now a target for mockery. The world saw a bum. Rick saw a target. No one saw the man. As Silas's trembling fingers began to gather the scattered coins, the cold metal against his skin felt like a brand of shame. But the chill didn't just come from the night air or the silver discs. It came from a place deep within him, a memory that the tug on his patch had violently dislodged from the past. The smell of gasoline and asphalt faded, replaced by the scent of damp earth, cordite, and fear. He wasn't in Alverton anymore. He was back in the Ia Drang Valley, 1968. The air was thick enough to drink, a humid soup of monsoon rain and gunpowder. He wasn't an old man with brittle bones. He was a 20-year-old specialist, lean and wiry, his face streaked with mud and sweat. Beside him was Corporal Danny Sunshine Miller, a kid from Ohio with a goofy grin and a photo of his high school sweetheart tucked into his helmet band. Danny had been the one to give him the patch, a spare from his own uniform, after Silas's had been torn off in a firefight. "Every man in the 1st Cav wears his colors, Ghost," Danny had said, his voice earnest. "It's how we know who we belong to. It's how we find our way home." They called him Ghost because he moved through the jungle with an eerie silence, and because he seemed to carry a profound stillness even in the heart of chaos. He never spoke of his life back home, never showed pictures, never joined in the boisterous letter readings. He was just there, a steady, quiet presence. The memory sharpened, focusing on a single, searing moment. An ambush. The world had exploded into a symphony of concussive blasts and the hornet whine of bullets. He remembered Danny's cry, a sharp, surprised sound, and the sight of him falling. Silas had crawled to him, the jungle floor a slurry of mud and blood, and held him as the light faded from his young eyes. Danny's last words were a whispered plea, not for himself, but for the girl in the photo. Tell her I was brave, Ghost. Tell my folks I loved them." And then he had pressed something into Silas's hand. It was his own 1st Cavalry patch, sticky with his blood. "You bring it home," Danny had choked out. "You bring us all home." Silas had made a promise in that jungle, a silent vow to a dying boy. He had survived the war, but the homecoming had been another kind of battle. The world he returned to was alien. The ticker-tape parades were for a different war, the protests and scorn for his. His family, unable to understand the man who came back, drifted away. His wife left, taking their daughter. The jobs never lasted. The nightmares never ended. He had lost his home, his family, his purpose. He had failed to keep his life together, failed to deliver Danny's message, failed everyone. All he had left was the promise. The patch on his jacket wasn't his. It was Danny's. He wore it not as a badge of honor, but as a mark of penance, a constant, physical reminder of the debt he felt he owed, a debt he could never repay. It was the last piece of the man he was supposed to be, the last link to a brotherhood forged in fire and loss. It was his anchor and his shame, the reason he endured the cold nights and the empty days. It was everything. Rick, emboldened by the lack of retaliation and the community's tacit approval of his cruelty, felt his boredom curdle into a more active malice. The old man's silent endurance was an affront, a challenge to his perceived dominance. He wanted to break him, to see him cry or beg or rage. He wanted a reaction that would validate his own power. He grabbed the large soda he'd just purchased from the convenience store, the cup slick with condensation. With a theatrical sigh, he tipped it over, letting the dark, sticky liquid gush onto the ground, forming a spreading puddle that crept toward Silas's meager belongings. The soda soaked the edge of the wool blanket, staining the faded gray fabric a dark, ugly brown. Pooled around the dented canteen, a final, petty insult. "Oops," Rick said with a hollow laugh. "Clumsy me. Guess you'll have a sticky bed tonight." Grandpa, his friends howled with laughter, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the lot. The pressure in the air became immense, a tangible thing. Inside the station, Kevin the attendant turned his back completely, busying himself by wiping down an already immaculate counter, his reflection in the glass showing a pained, conflicted expression. He was just a kid earning minimum wage. What could he do? The woman in the minivan, who had been about to drive away, paused, her engine idling. She watched the scene in her rearview mirror, her face a mask of fear and indecision. Her inaction was a choice, a vote for non-involvement, a silent prayer that the trouble would not turn its attention to her. For Silas, the world narrowed to the spreading stain on his blanket. That blanket had been a gift from a church volunteer years ago. It had seen him through freezing winters and rain-soaked nights. It was one of the few comforts he possessed. The violation felt intensely personal, a desecration of his small, fragile world. Every instinct screamed at him. The ghost, the soldier who had faced down death in the jungle, wanted to rise. The part of him that was still 20 years old and forged in combat wanted to wrap his hands around Rick's throat. But he fought it down. Violence was a language he had promised himself he would never speak again. It had taken everything from him once. He would not let it claim what little he had left. So he endured. He sat perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, his breathing slow and even. His dignity became a fortress, his silence a weapon Rick could not understand and therefore could not defeat. The thug's sneer faltered slightly. This wasn't fun anymore. The old man wasn't playing his part. The silence from the bum on the curb was louder than all of Rick's taunts, and it was beginning to unnerve him. Just as Rick was about to escalate further, perhaps to physically assault the old man, a different kind of drama unfolded at the edge of the scene. A beat-up sedan sputtered to a stop next to the pumps, and a teenage girl, no older than 16, got out. She looked flustered and scared, clearly intimidated by Rick and his cronies. She clutched her purse tightly as she hurried toward the convenience store door, keeping her head down. As she fumbled for the handle, her grip on her wallet slipped. It fell to the ground, spilling its contents. A driver's license, a student ID, and 3 worn $20 bills that fluttered in the biting wind. The girl gasped a small, frightened sound. Rick's eyes lit up with predatory glee. Easy money. He and his friends started to move toward the scattered bills, a pack of hyenas sensing a kill. But before they could take a single step, something remarkable happened. Silas moved. It wasn't the slow, pained shuffle of an old, broken man. It was the swift, economical movement of a soldier. He uncoiled from his position on the curb with a surprising, fluid grace. He was on his feet and had covered the 10 feet to the scattered money in an instant. His gnarled, dirt-caked fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, were now deft and sure. He gathered the 3 bills, his touch gentle on the worn paper. He picked up the wallet and the plastic cards, carefully tucking everything back inside. For a moment, he held the $60 in his hand. It was a fortune. It was more money than he had seen in one place in over a year. It was hot food, a new blanket, a night in a warm motel room away from the wind that gnawed at his bones. It was a brief reprieve from the crushing weight of his existence. The temptation must have been immense, a siren call in the desolate landscape of his life. Rick watched, a smirk on his face, expecting the old man to pocket the cash. It was what he would have done. It was what any sensible person in that position would do. But Silas did not even hesitate. He walked directly to the terrified girl, who stood frozen by the door. He extended his hand, offering her the wallet. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, there was no judgment, no self-pity, only a quiet, profound integrity. He, a man with nothing, who had just been publicly humiliated and had his last worldly possessions defiled, performed an act of pure, selfless honor. He chose his principles over his desperation, his character over his circumstance. The teenage girl stared, first at the wallet in Silas's outstretched hand, then at his face. Her fear slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which then softened into something akin to awe. She took the wallet, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you so much." Her mother, who had been watching the entire exchange from the driver's seat of the minivan with a knot of anxiety in her stomach, felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had been ready to drive away, to abandon this old man to his fate. She had judged him, dismissed him as a threat or a nuisance. Now she saw him for what he was, a man of quiet, unshakable honor. Her expression hardened, but this time, the hardness was directed at Rick. Inside the store, Kevin the attendant had also witnessed the act. He had been frozen by fear, but seeing Silas's simple, decent act seemed to thaw something inside him. He stood up straighter, his gaze on Silas filled with a newfound respect. The entire dynamic of the parking lot had shifted. The silent judgment of the onlookers, which had previously been directed at Silas, now fell squarely on Rick. The power he wielded came from intimidation and the assumption of his victim's weakness. But Silas hadn't been weak. He had shown a strength that Rick couldn't comprehend, a currency of character that devalued Rick's cheap bravado. Rick felt the change in the atmosphere. The laughter from his friends died down, replaced by an awkward silence. His attempt to mock Silas now felt hollow, childish. "What, you playing the hero now, old man?" he sneered, trying to reclaim control. "Think that little girl's gonna give you a reward?" But his words lacked their earlier venom. They were the bluster of a bully who senses his audience has turned against him. The girl, emboldened by Silas's action, found her voice. She turned to Rick, her chin held high. "He's a better man than you'll ever be," she said, her voice clear and steady. With that, she turned and walked back to her car, her mother giving Silas a long, meaningful nod of respect before pulling away. The silent consensus of the small audience was clear. The hero of this story was not the one with the loud car and the swagger, but the silent, forgotten man on the curb. And just as this new truth settled over the cold asphalt, a new sound began to intrude, a sound from far away, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the very ground itself. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a faint thrumming on the edge of hearing, easily mistaken for a passing truck on a distant road. But it didn't fade. It grew steadily, insistently. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of their shoes, a bass note that seemed to shake the very air. Rick and his friends stopped their posturing, glancing around in confusion. Kevin stepped out from behind the counter, peering through the glass door. The rumble intensified, multiplying, becoming a chorus of rhythmic, powerful beats. It was the sound of thunder, but this was a clear, cold night. Then, over the gentle slope of the road leading into town, a single pinpoint of light appeared. It was followed by another and another, until a constellation of headlights crested the hill, a brilliant, menacing wave of chrome and steel. The sound became a deafening roar, an apocalyptic symphony of V-twin engines. It was not a group of motorcycles. It was an army. They poured into the gas station lot with the terrifying precision of a cavalry charge. 10 bikes, then 20, then 50, then 100, then more. They filled every available space, their engines idling in a synchronized, intimidating growl that drowned out all other sound. They formed a perfect, suffocating circle around the scene, their headlights cutting through the darkness, pinning Rick and his cherry-red car in a brilliant, inescapable spotlight. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal, leather, and exhaust fumes. The men on the bikes were titans, clad in worn leather vests, their cuts adorned with the profane iconography of the Hells Angels. They were a legion of bearded, scarred, and hardened faces, each one a story of a life lived on the ragged edge. They sat on their machines like kings on iron thrones, their collective presence a crushing weight. The community onlookers, who had been a handful of disconnected individuals, were now a single, terrified audience. They were frozen in their cars, behind the glass, witnessing the arrival of a force of nature. Rick and his friends were paralyzed, their cheap arrogance evaporating like mist in a furnace blast. The leader of the pack swung his leg over his bike and dismounted. He was a mountain of a man, his beard braided with silver rings, his face a roadmap of hard miles. On the back of his vest, the Death's Head logo was massive, a proclamation of allegiance. His boots hit the asphalt with a heavy, deliberate thud. The other engines fell to a low, rumbling idle, but did not go silent. This man was known only as Preacher, a name earned for his ability to deliver sermons of loyalty and, when necessary, sermons of pain. But he did not look at Rick. He did not acknowledge the terrified onlookers. His eyes, intense and piercing, scanned the scene and settled, with unwavering focus, on the frail, silent figure of Silas. Preacher moved with a purpose that belied his massive frame, his boots crunching on the scattered gravel. The The sea of bikers parted for him as he walked a direct line to Silas, who remained by the curb, a silent observer to the maelstrom that had descended upon his small patch of concrete. The air crackled with tension. Rick and his friends seemed to shrink, their bravado completely extinguished, replaced by a primal animal fear. Preacher stopped a few feet from Silas. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his shadow engulfing the old man. His gaze was not hostile, but intensely analytical. He looked at Silas's thin frame, his worn-out boots, and the fresh, dark stain on his blanket. Then, his eyes locked onto the faded patch on Silas's shoulder. He stared at it for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. And then, in a gesture that sent a shockwave through everyone watching, the formidable leader of the Hell's Angels bent his knee and knelt. He knelt in the dirt and grime of the gas station parking lot, bringing himself eye level with the homeless man. The entire brotherhood of bikers, 150 strong, watched in reverent silence. The only sound was the throbbing idle of their engines, a mechanical heartbeat for the unfolding drama. Preacher reached out a gloved hand, not to grab, but to gently trace the outline of the patch with his forefinger, his touch surprisingly delicate. "First Cavalry Division," Preacher said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried with absolute authority over the sound of the bikes. "Airmobile. My old man wore one just like it. Vietnam." He looked from the patch to Silas's eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed between them. "My father," Preacher continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He served with a man they called the Ghost, a quiet fella who pulled 3 of his wounded brothers out of a hot LZ during the Tet Offensive. They put him in for a Silver Star, but he refused it. Said the only honor that mattered was bringing his men home. My dad was one of those men he pulled out. He told me that story 100 times before he passed. He said he owed his life, my life, to a soldier named Silas." The revelation hung in the air, stunning the onlookers into absolute silence. The teenager behind the counter, Kevin, suddenly recalled his grandfather, a VFW member, talking about a local war hero who had just disappeared years ago after his wife and daughter died in a car crash. A man who couldn't bear the world anymore and just walked away. The pieces clicked into place with an audible, collective gasp from the small crowd. The woman from the minivan, who had parked across the street to watch, began to cry softly. The homeless bum, the town mascot, the invisible man was a hero. He was the Ghost. Preacher slowly rose to his full, intimidating height and turned to face Rick. The shift in his demeanor was terrifying. His eyes, which had been filled with a kind of reverent curiosity when looking at Silas, now burned with an icy, controlled fury. "You," he growled, the single word a death sentence. "You put your hands on this man's colors. You spit on his service. You disrespected a brother." Rick was trembling uncontrollably, his face ashen white in the glare of the headlights. He tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, but the words caught in his throat, choked by sheer terror. His friends were no help. They stood frozen, looking like they would bolt at the slightest provocation. But the bikers did not move on them. There was no need for physical violence. Their judgment was delivered through their silent, suffocating presence. They formed a tighter ring, their collective gaze a physical force that stripped Rick of his pride, his power, and his pathetic sense of self-worth. He was utterly and completely broken by their silent contempt. Preacher turned his back on the whimpering thug, dismissing him as insignificant. He walked back to Silas and, in a move that shocked everyone, began to unbuckle his own vest. The cute of a Hell's Angel is a sacred object, a symbol of identity, loyalty, and years of earned respect. To remove it for another is the highest honor one can bestow. He gently, almost tenderly, draped the heavy leather vest over Silas's thin, stooped shoulders. The Death's Head logo on the back seemed to cloak him in a new, formidable identity. "You're with us now, brother," Preacher said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "No one will ever lay a hand on you again. You're under the protection of the Hell's Angels, The gesture was profoundly symbolic. It was a transfer of power, an adoption into a new family, a restoration of a lost brotherhood. Then, a new ritual began. One by one, the other bikers dismounted their Harleys. They formed a long, single-file line that snaked through the parking lot. Each hardened man, some with faces that looked like they were carved from granite, walked past Silas. They didn't speak. They simply paused in front of him, looked him in the eye, and gave a slow, deliberate nod of profound respect. Some reached out to clasp his shoulder. Others simply touched the brim of their helmets. Following Preacher's lead, they began to offer tribute. They pulled wads of cash from their pockets, 20s, 50s, 100s, and placed them not at his feet, but into a helmet that one of the bikers had set respectfully on the ground beside him. It wasn't charity. It was a tithe. It was back pay for a lifetime of service and suffering. It was an apology from a world that had forgotten him. The bikers did not leave right away. Their thunderous arrival had been a declaration. Their continued presence was a vigil. They became a temporary, self-contained city in the gas station lot, a fortress of leather and chrome built around one old man. The initial terror of the townspeople slowly subsided, replaced by a sense of profound wonder. The bikers, figures often associated with fear and lawlessness, were acting with a kind of solemn, disciplined grace. Several of them went into the convenience store not to intimidate, but to buy every last drop of coffee and all the prepackaged sandwiches and donuts. They paid in cash, telling a still-stunned Kevin to keep the change. They brought the food and coffee out to Silas, sitting with him on the curb, sharing their bounty. They didn't pry or ask him for war stories. They just shared the quiet space with him, a silent communion of men who understood that some burdens are carried without words. One biker, a burly man with wrench stitched on his vest, noticed the loose, flapping sole on Silas's boot. Without a word, he went to his saddlebag, pulled out a roll of heavy-duty Gorilla Tape, and knelt down to meticulously repair the boot, ensuring it was solid and secure. It was a small act, but deeply practical and caring. Meanwhile, Rick and his friends remained trapped in the circle of judgment. They were forced to watch this display of respect and brotherhood, a stark contrast to their own shallow cruelty. The weight of 150 pairs of eyes on them was a punishment far more severe than any physical beating. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Preacher gave a subtle nod. The bikers shifted, creating a narrow lane for the muscle car to exit. Rick scrambled into the driver's seat, not even looking back at his friends, who piled in after him. He peeled out of the lot, the squeal of his tires a sound not of arrogance, but of pure, unadulterated fear. He was gone, his power in Alverton broken forever. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, the vigil came to an end. Preacher helped Silas to his feet. The Hell's Angel's vest hung on his small frame like a king's robe. "We've got a place for you, Silas," Preacher said gently. "A room at the clubhouse. Warm bed, hot meals. For as long as you want it. Your family, for the first time all night." Silas spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. "Thank you," he said, and in those two simple words, a lifetime of pain and solitude began to recede. He accepted. He climbed onto the back of Preacher's gleaming Harley, his hands resting on the shoulders of the man whose father he had saved half a century ago. The final, lingering image was one of powerful, redemptive beauty. At a signal from Preacher, 150 Harley-Davidson engines roared to life in a single, deafening crescendo, a sound of resurrection. The column of bikes pulled out of the lot, a river of steel and thunder, carrying Silas away from his life of invisibility and neglect. They left behind a transformed town. Kevin was already on the phone, excitedly telling his grandfather what he had witnessed. The woman across the street was explaining to her child the difference between a bully and a hero. The story of Silas, the ghost of Alverton, would become a local legend, a cautionary tale about judging the book by its cover, a reminder that honor can be found in the most unlikely of places. Riding on the back of that bike, with the wind in his face and the protective weight of the cute on his shoulders, Silas was no longer a ghost. He was found. His dignity, long buried, was restored, and his long journey home was finally over.